We have more evidence for the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin than literally any other artifact in human history, and I'm going to show how that evidence not only confirms that it was Jesus' real burial cloth, but even reveals something that science still can't explain, something that might prove the resurrection of Jesus. In 1978, a group of scientists were granted direct access to the Shroud of Turin, and many of them expected to easily disprove it as a medieval hoax. They collected microscopic particles embedded in the fibers of the shroud, and among those particles were pollen grains. Botanical analysis revealed plant species native to the Middle East, and some plants that grow specifically in Israel and the surrounding region. Plants that are completely missing from Italy and France. But it gets even deeper. Scientists also identified microscopic limestone dust that perfectly matches dust outside the walls of Jerusalem.
So the dust in Jerusalem has a certain makeup because it has a slightly higher component of strontium in it.
And that mineral is what gives the sample a chemical fingerprint. And that's how they're able to say with a great degree of certainty that this matches the soil samples around the walls of Jerusalem.
Now there's something really interesting about where on the cloth they found this limestone dust, but I'll get to that in a little bit. Today the Shroud of Turin is preserved in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy. And since the Middle Ages, we have undisputed documentation of where it's been. Church correspondences, legal documents, and eyewitness accounts all place the shroud in Europe. Now, prior to the 1300s, all we have are scattered references and clues, the kinds of things that historians will debate endlessly. But if we're being intellectually honest, taking the scientific evidence and the historical record together, we have a pretty strong case that the shroud originated in Jerusalem, where Jesus was crucified, and traveled through the Middle East before appearing in Europe in the Middle Ages. Now I want to tell you about the bloodstains they found on the shroud and how they provide an astounding amount of evidence that this really is the burial cloth of Jesus. But first, there's something we've been looking at this entire time that we haven't addressed: the cloth itself. When textile experts examined the material of the shroud, they identified that it was composed of costly fine linen woven in a sophisticated pattern, a luxurious cloth made by a skilled craftsman. And when one archaeologist compared it to hundreds of burial textiles excavated from Roman-era Judea, she found a glaring inconsistency. Local burial cloths were almost always plain, simple linen, wrapped in strips around the body, not a single bolt of expensive cloth. So, is this a strike against authenticity? Well, let's look at what scripture actually says. All three synoptic gospels tell us that Jesus' burial cloth was purchased by Joseph of Arimathea, whom Matthew explicitly describes as a wealthy man. And the word that all three gospels use to describe the cloth that he purchased is sindon, which literally means a single piece of fine linen. Not strips or bands, but one large piece of expensive cloth. But it gets even deeper. When forensic pathologists examined the bloodstains on the shroud, they found that they were produced by real blood flowing from wounds consistent with Roman crucifixion. Nearly 700 scourge marks across the front and back of the body, nail wounds in the feet and the wrists, bifurcated blood flow down the forearms, suggesting that the arms were in two different positions while the blood was flowing. Exactly what we would expect of a crucified man. Now, the Roman Empire crucified thousands of people outside the walls of Jerusalem, and we have extensive historical documentation of how it was done. But the bloodstains on the Shroud of Turin show wounds that appear in only one account of Roman crucifixion.
There is no evidence at all of anyone else having been crucified with a crown of thorns. There's no documentation or anything like that.
There are over 50 wounds on the scalp and the nape of the neck that are independent from the scourging wounds that are from the cap or crown of thorns.
But that's not all. Forensic analysis also revealed a single elliptical wound between the 5th and 6th rib on the right side.
The bloodstain that we see on the shrouds shows a wound that exactly matches the Roman lancia. It's the same width and the same length as what we would expect from standard issue Roman foot soldier's weapon.
The blood from the spear wound on the Shroud of Turin tested as post-mortem, meaning the person was already dead when it was inflicted. But here's where it gets interesting.
When they photographed the shroud, they could see around the spear wound there were clear halos that cannot be seen with the naked eye.
The Gospel of John says that Jesus' side was pierced by a Roman soldier after he was already dead, and that blood and water flowed out. Exactly what we see on the Shroud of Turin. These were not standard features of Roman crucifixion. They only appear in the Gospels, and the bloodstains on the shroud couldn't have been painted on. The specific chemistry of the blood was from a man who had suffered catastrophic physical trauma before death. And the flow of the blood was a perfect forensic match, not just to any crucified victim, but specifically to the wounds of Christ. Unless a forger somehow anticipated modern forensic science and figured out a way to replicate this that scientists still don't understand, reproducing these bloodstains would require scourging, crucifying, and killing a real human being. And if that isn't enough evidence of the shroud's authenticity, there's one other extraordinary detail about the bloodstains on the shroud that scientists still can't explain.
You can have a forensic pathologist look at the early degradation products in a crime scene, and they tell you how long the body's been dead. So on the shroud, they say the body's been dead for about 36 to 40 hours.
This timeline exactly matches the gospel accounts of Jesus being placed in the tomb Friday evening and Mary Magdalene finding the tomb empty Sunday morning. So we've looked at the evidence surrounding the bloodstains on the shroud and how they not only show that the shroud was stained by the body of a crucified man bearing wounds described only in the Gospels, but that those wounds were in contact with the cloth for no more than 40 hours, exactly like what we read in Scripture. Now, at this point, let's try to play devil's advocate. We have an abundance of evidence that the Shroud of Turin is Jesus' actual burial cloth. But because the historical record doesn't show an unbroken chain of custody back to Jerusalem in the 1st century, skeptics will still claim that this is a medieval forgery. But what would a medieval forger have to do to produce this artifact? Well, they'd have to source a sophisticated, expensive linen of the correct dimensions and weave, embed pollen from plant species native to the Middle East and Jerusalem, plants that don't grow in Europe. They'd have to embed microscopic limestone dust consistent with ancient Jerusalem tomb rock. And remember, this evidence is even more powerful because of where on the shroud it was found, on the feet, the knee, and the nose. Exactly the places you'd expect if the man on the shroud had fallen forward outside the walls of Jerusalem under a heavy load. This forger would also have to torture a living person severely enough to produce real blood with the correct hemoglobin, bilirubin, and protein chemistry. They'd have to pierce the body post-mortem between the 5th and 6th rib to produce a wound consistent with the blade of a Roman thrusting spear. They'd have to include puncture wounds around the entire scalp, consistent with a cap of sharp thorns, a detail, by the way, missing in every medieval depiction of Christ's death. They'd have to arrange the bloodstains in patterns consistent with forensic blood flow of wounds that were in contact with the cloth for no more than 40 hours, and do all of this without leaving a single brushstroke. Then, somehow, produce the image of the crucified man on top. Every single one of these details was completely indetectable in the Middle Ages, and some of them even contradict what we see in medieval art. There were no microscopes, no spectrometers, no forensic science or tools to detect this level of accuracy. A medieval forger couldn't have known these tests would ever exist, let alone engineer a cloth to pass all of them. At some point, the evidence stops being a purely academic question. Why do so many skeptics, including scientists, still claim that the shroud is a medieval forgery? Well, there's actually one piece of evidence we haven't talked about yet. Hey, really quick, before we get into that, I need to tell you about something we've been working on behind the scenes here. Now, obviously Truthfully is a YouTube channel. For the last 2 years, we've been building an AI tool for Catholics and just honest seekers with the functionality of major AI apps, but built on a completely different premise. Most AI affirms you and keeps you hooked. You get what you want to hear, but not necessarily the truth. Truthfully is built differently. You can ask it literally any question, religious or not, and get answers from a Catholic perspective, optimized for truth, not engagement or affirmation. Right now, you can click the link in the description below or use code SHROUD at signup to get Truthfully for 30 days free. Now, back to the video. In 1988, a team of scientists were granted permission to take a small sample of the Shroud of Turin to conduct a radiocarbon dating test. Now, carbon dating is one of the most reliable tools in science because carbon-14 is a molecule found in all organic material that decays at an incredibly predictable rate. So by measuring the amount that remains in a given sample, scientists can accurately determine its age with up to 95% confidence when the test is done correctly. And when the results came back on the Shroud of Turin, the laboratory's findings were shocking. The shroud dated to between 1260 and 1390 AD, the Middle Ages. This wasn't a margin of error issue. It's not decades off. It's over 1,000 years off. This stands in direct contradiction to everything we've seen, and carbon dating is considered definitive. So what does this mean? I mean, if the shroud dates back to the Middle Ages, where we have the strongest historical evidence of its existence in the first place, then it would have to be a medieval forgery, right? Well, not quite. Because the scientists who designed the original testing protocol called for 5 to 7 samples to be taken from across the cloth, multiple sites, multiple labs, and multiple methods. But at the last minute, the protocol was overruled. They only took one sample from one location on the shroud, one corner that had been visibly contaminated.
If you talk to Dr. Jackson, he wrote the protocol. 5 to 7 sample sites, and at the last minute, they said, no, you can only take one sample site, and you have to take it from this corner. Well, the chemistry and the spectrophotometric chemical analysis of that corner is totally contaminated.
Under ultraviolet light, scientists could see that the corner where the sample was taken is chemically different from the rest of the shroud, and when the fibers were examined, they were shown to contain cotton threads woven into the linen, meaning this was a repair. The laboratories weren't dating the actual cloth of the shroud. They were dating some kind of seamless medieval patch.
And Ray Rogers showed that some of those fibrils had cotton. You can't put linen and cotton together.
And so the conclusion that they can say is that that small sample is not representative of the entire cloth.
All 3 labs threw the data out because of Tristan Casabianca. He got the raw data, as you know, from the Oxford. They said, you can't draw a conclusion from our data anymore. And when it came out, they said 95% confidence interval. They said, no, we're not anywhere close to 95%.
This isn't a fringe theory. This is settled science published in Archaeometry, the peer-reviewed journal of the British Museum, the same institution that oversaw the original test in 1988. The test that was supposed to settle the question of the shroud's age turned out to be based on a single contaminated sample, tested with a compromised protocol, producing data that was hidden for nearly 30 years and has now been dismissed by the very labs that produced it. And while this single test has dominated headlines for decades, 5 other independent dating methods, vanillin degradation, infrared spectroscopy, Raman spectroscopy, mechanical fiber testing, and X-ray diffraction, have all been applied to the shroud. And every single one of them have placed the shroud's origin in the 1st century. Now, shockingly, many skeptics still cite this debunked 1988 carbon dating study as proof that the shroud is a fake. But there's one detail about the shroud that we haven't talked about yet, one that sits apart from everything else: the pollen, the limestone dust, the wounds. A detail that no scientist, skeptic, or believer has been able to explain or replicate. When the Shroud of Turin was photographed for the very first time in 1898, the man behind the camera was an amateur Italian photographer named Secondo Pia. What people had always seen when they looked at the shroud was a faint, ghostly discoloration. But when Pia developed his glass plate in the darkroom that night, what he saw was so shocking that he nearly dropped it. When he expected to see an indiscernible photonegative, he saw this image. You see, when his photonegative reversed the image on the shroud, it revealed that the shroud itself possesses a photonegative quality, so the reversed image is the true image of the man buried in it. But that was only the beginning. In 1976, researchers fed an image of the shroud into a VP8 image analyzer, a device developed by NASA to convert photographs into topographical maps of planetary surfaces. When used on any normal image, it produces a completely distorted result because brightness doesn't correspond to depth unless the subject is emanating light. But when the results came back on the shroud, it had produced a perfect 3-dimensional relief of a human body. Facial features, chest, arms, all perfectly contoured. So the image on the shroud didn't just record what the body looked like. It encoded the precise distance between the cloth and the body at every point of contact. No painting has ever done this, no photograph, nothing created by human hands. This discovery sent shockwaves through the scientific community, and after 3 years of laboratory analysis, scientists determined that there were no pigments, paints, dyes, or stains of any kind on the fibrils of the image. They couldn't identify a single known mechanism that could have produced it. What they did find was this: the image itself is a faint oxidation of the linen fibers themselves, penetrating to a depth of just 0.2 microns. That's nearly 1,000 times thinner than the average human hair. The discoloration exists only on the outermost surface of the outermost fibers, meaning whatever produced the image chemically altered the fibers of the cloth with submicroscopic precision across the entire surface of a human body. So how was the image produced? The best attempt to reproduce this effect came from a team at Italy's ENEA Research Center who spent 5 years firing state-of-the-art excimer lasers, pulses of vacuum ultraviolet radiation at small patches of linen. They succeeded in producing a faint shroud-like discoloration on patches of linen a centimeter wide, but they determined that it was practically impossible to reproduce this effect across the entire surface of the shroud's image, because it would require 34 trillion watts of energy. That is 10 times the entire electrical output of the global power grid, released in a fraction of a second. If this is how the image on the shroud was created, and it's the best theory we have, it would mean that the man inside radiated an inconceivable amount of energy from every direction in his body simultaneously. The forgery theory doesn't just struggle with this, it collapses entirely. And here's where we reach the edge of what science can tell us. We know what producing an image like this would require. What we don't know, what science can't tell us, is what actually happened inside that tomb. But there's one account that can. An account that describes a crucified man, wrapped in linen, undergoing a transformation that no natural cause can account for, leaving behind an empty tomb and a linen cloth that once bound him. 2,000 years ago, the Apostle John ran to that tomb. He looked inside and he saw the linen cloth lying there, empty. And something shifted inside of him. In his own words, he saw and he believed. And I have a confession to make. I was a little dishonest with you in the beginning. I said that the Shroud of Turin might be able to prove the resurrection of Jesus, but that's not actually the case. The Shroud offers an overwhelming amount of evidence that perfectly aligns with Scripture and points super abundantly to the resurrection of Jesus. But it can't prove it, because proof leaves no room for faith, and God respects our freedom. You can look at all the evidence and still choose not to believe. For John, walking into that tomb on Easter morning, seeing the empty cloth lying there was enough for him to believe. And we have very good reason to believe that that same cloth is in Turin, Italy today, bearing more evidence for Jesus' resurrection than John could have ever imagined. You've seen it. But the question remains, do you believe?